Now, a lot of times when we talk about major types of economies, another way of looking at it is market-based and command economies. Now, um, whenever you have a market economy, basically market economy means that everybody is making their own decisions. Individuals are making their own decisions. Individual businesses are making their own decisions. And government is largely staying hands off. Decisions are being made by buyers and sellers. Command economy is the complete opposite. Buyers and sellers aren't really making any decisions. All the decisions are being made by the government. You're very rarely going to see a pure market economy and a pure command economy. Generally, what you're going to see is some sort of mixture. A lot of people think, oh, well, the US is a free market economy. That's not true at all. We have all sorts of government interventions, whether you think about them or not. Um, but there's definitely economies that are way more on the market end and way more on the command end. Um, so the Heritage Foundation produces this index of economic freedom. They are not, completely unbiased here, but I thought this was a useful resource because it really kind of shows kind of a continuum of what a completely market-based system looks like and what a completely command-based system looks like. So on one extreme, you've got North Korea. There's no countries even close to the kind of command economy that you see in North Korea. You are not making any decisions on your own over there. And then on the other extreme, we have like Hong Kong and Singapore, where the government is relatively hands off. They're letting businesses kind of make their own choices on a lot of stuff. And then, the US kind of lies kind of in this area right here, where you've got some government intervention, but we're still kind of on the market side. And then you've got kind of everything in between. Now, generally, you'll see that kind of your most prosperous nations are kind of in this area right here. Not necessarily on, way over here with complete freedom, but kind of over here where there's a lot of freedom, but there's also a little bit of government intervention. Where the exact sweet spot lies as far as what's best for a nation is kind of up for debate a little bit, and part of it has to do with your own preferences. Um, but this is pretty close to somewhere around here is about where we think the ideal might be. Um, so we talked about these three questions earlier. How do market economies answer this, and how do command economies answer these questions? Well, what are we going to make? In a market economy, firms make the choices, but those choices really get decided by you and me, because we've talked about this a little bit. If they sell something that we don't want, we don't buy it. And they go, oh, probably shouldn't make that. And they either go out of business or they change. How are we going to produce it? Well, they're going to pick their own production methods, and eventually we're going to see the most efficient production methods win out, because they're going to be able to drive costs down, and consumers are going to be attracted to those lower costs. Now, this is assuming perfect competition, which, again, that's where we start to see some imperfections where companies aren't really having to compete, and so we don't see kind of the best methods being used. But largely, this will lead to that productive efficiency that we were looking for earlier, that lowest average cost. Who gets it? All right, here's a big thing you need to remember. In a market economy, goods and services go to those who are willing and able to purchase them. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. Goods and services go to those who are willing and able to purchase them. Now, this leads to two kind of good things. Willing means that the goods and services are going to go to those who value them the most highly, at least ideally. we'll talk about issues there in a second. The second half is able. Able means that they actually have the resources to afford it. There's a lot of people who would be willing to purchase for a given price, but they just flat run out of resources to buy it with. Because there's this able condition there, that's going to force people to work as hard and work as efficiently as they can to be able to afford more things. This willing part, again, means that goods and services are going to mostly go to those who value it the most highly. Now, we got to be a little careful here. When I say that goods and services go to those who value it the most highly, I'm basically saying value it most highly in dollars, okay? And as it turns out, rich people value pretty much everything more highly because they have more dollars. So we're going to see it going more towards rich people. Also, this able, we've made the assumption so far that rich people are rich because they work harder, work more efficiently. And some of that is true, but we also know that a lot of wealth is based on inherited wealth. There's something that economists call rent-seeking behavior, which is basically where people try to make money by doing nothing. That's where you say, okay, well, I own this property and I'm going to basically rent out this property. I'm not really doing anything, but I'm making money off of money that I had before, essentially. So again, this is not quite as ideal as I'm making it out to be, but it actually does a fairly good job of making sure goods and services go to those who value it the most highly, and that people are working efficiently to try to produce for society. Now, command economies, especially full command economies, the answers to these questions are pretty simple. What are we going to make? The government decides. If they decide we need more of this, we're going to produce more of this, they build the factory. They grab the workers and say, you're going to work here. And they're making all of those decisions. One of the issues with this is often the production needs don't match the needs of the country. How are we going to make it? Who's going to produce it? The government picks. They may or may not pick the most efficient method. There's not really incentives for efficient production unless those people are, in danger of getting voted out. So a lot of times, you're not going to see these efficient production methods that you see in more market-based economies. Who gets the goods and the services, and how much are they going to get? Well, basically, the government decides. If they say you're going to get this much, that's how much you're going to get. I want to take an aside to talk about communism because communism is kind of one form of command economy, and I don't think it really started out as that idea. If you look at the idea of communism, and if you read some of the stuff that Karl Marx wrote, the idea is that we're going to take from each according to their abilities, and we're going to give to each according to their needs. And what's funny is you'll see this sometimes work actually really well, but really only in small groups. And we'll talk about why it works in smaller groups and not bigger groups. The way that this happens is, we talked about how capital tends to be owned by the rich. And since capital is owned by the rich, it really hurts mobility for everybody else. And it's really hard for poorer people to move up because they can't afford capital. They have to work for someone who owns the capital. So the idea under communism is that you have this social ownership. It's owned by everybody. It's owned by the community. The problem is that once you get into larger groups, people become less willing to share. They're less willing to give up their personal property to somebody else. So people in large communities, they don't want to give up their stuff. They're like, no, I made this. I worked for this. I don't want you to have it. So in a kind of more idealized vision of communism, everybody's sharing stuff. But what happens is in these larger communities where people aren't sharing willingly, um, you have to take it by force. And once we're taking it by force, we've moved from things being socially owned to being government owned. And unfortunately, when you have the situation where it's government owned, this usually leads to a lot of corruption. Um, if you think about it, okay, if you're in a situation, no matter how high minded you are, if you become in charge of who gets what, um, the people who are going to get the most are the people surrounding you. And that's what we see typically in very extreme command economies. The people who thrive in command economies are the people who are close to government, the people who do favors for the government, the family of the government, the friends of the government. Those are the people who get the really nice stuff, and everybody else kind of gets the breadcrumbs that are left over. Um, Also, we've talked about this before. If we decide that everyone is going to get the same everything, that leads to loss of incentives, leads to generally inefficient production, inefficient allocation, and command economies are very, very, very slow to respond to change. Um, they are very quick about building new infrastructure. That would be something I would consider an advantage. But as far as, oh, the people want this, so now let's make this, usually they're much, much slower in adopting changes. So um, I'm not trying to brainwash you too much here. Most economists really do favor a more market-based approach. Now, we've talked about different rationales why we need some government intervention. Um, you know, when we have completely market-based, we don't do a very good job of responding to externalities. We don't always do a good job of building infrastructure. Um, but apart from some of that, um, we really do like some of the market-based stuff. But that comes with some issues too. Like for example, right now the government purchased a lot of coronavirus vaccine, and right now it's going to first responders and it's going to elderly folks. Now, if we defined it, if we allocated our resources in a purely free market way, who would be getting the vaccine first? It would be people who were willing to pay the most. I'm sure there would be a bidding war where, first of all, rich people trying to get it for themselves, but also trying to get it for their workers so they can avoid shutdowns. Um, and arguably, that's not a very good way to distribute these resources. So this is always going to be a tricky thing of, which economic system do we choose? How are we going to make these decisions? But hopefully this gave you at least an overview of the different ways of thinking about it.